Throughout December, I released a series of shorts, one per day, each looking at an interesting change or addition that the novelisation of Serenity made versus the movie. This video is a simple compilation of those shorts, now in the traditional landscape format. At the end of the compilation, I will include some closing impressions that I had of the novel. The novel begins with a flashback to Serenity Valley, recounting the first scene we see in Firefly. The scene is virtually identical to what we see in the show, but seeing it with the third-person perspective lets us hear Mal's thoughts, which is an interesting change. Particularly poignant, this novel lets us hear Mal's thoughts during the final slow-mo shot from the flashback scene. For all the weeks they'd been holding Serenity Valley, the sounds of battle had become so much white noise to Mal. Now, though, it was like all his senses were more acute than ever. He smelled the acrid ozone of the bullets flying through the air, including the one that struck Bendis in the chest, killing him instantly as he stood next to Mal. He felt the ground shake as the Alliance vessel's thrusters slammed against the ground to permit them a soft landing. He tasted the bitter adrenaline combined with bile at the realization of what was happening. He heard Zoe say that the Independents were asking the Alliance for a parley to discuss terms of surrender, and he saw hail and fire being hurled down upon the earth and mixing with the blood of the people Mal Reynolds had called comrades. The novel manages to reincorporate deleted scenes from Firefly, as the novel shows us Serenity Valley in the aftermath of the final battle, showing us the scene that Zoe describes to Simon in the deleted scene about how the Alliance and the Independents left the remaining soldiers for weeks in Serenity Valley while the peace was negotiated. This scene then ends by segueing into another deleted scene where the medships finally arrive to collect the few remaining survivors. What I found really neat is that Zoe acknowledges that she's seen Mal change since losing the battle. Throughout it all, Sergeant Mal Reynolds kept the troops going as best he could. Anyone else in charge, Zoe was sure they'd all be dead. But he managed to keep everyone going, with jokes, with inspiration, with anything he could throw at them, except, she noticed, after the third day, for hope. The hope that he had instilled in the troops from day one was gone. Had Zoe not been so concerned with whether or not she'd starve to death, she might have mentioned it. As it was, she was content to let him be. The novelisation of Serenity includes, as a prelude scene, the flashback from Safe, in which Simon fights with his parents regarding River's well-being at the academy. It expands the scene, including describing how River's code to Simon worked. In each letter, River mentions a book that she owns. The first word of each letter is always 1, 2, or 3 letters long. That indicates whether it should be the first, second, or third letter of each word that I pay attention to for the code. That letter corresponds to a number from 1 to 26. And the first letter on that particular page is the next letter in the message she's sending. Every letter, every single letter, has the same message.
They're hurting us. Get me out.
The novelisation of Serenity describes how the underground movement reached Simon and initiated their partnership. Because Simon had been so worried and distracted at work, the hospital put him on low-priority patients. The underground movement, comprised of other people who've lost family members to the academy, admit themselves to hospital in order to speak with Simon. There's then a scene in which Simon meets with the movement at a bar to arrange the rescue. Interestingly, this scene implies the academy takes boys and older people as well. Pointing at the woman next to Simon, Garcia said, "Martina here, she's got herself a son at that place where they bring your sister." He indicated the man next to him with his head. "Stanislaus here, he got a wife in there. Me, I ain't got no one, but those two folk been by my side most of my adult life, and I don't reckon to see 'em hurt none. Now we have the means to get someone on the inside to work and escape." The Academy flashback is seen partially from Dr. Matthias' perspective in the novelisation, which, through narration, lets us hear how annoyed and uncomfortable Dr. Matthias is around the supposed Alliance inspector. The perspective is passed to Simon after Matthias is knocked out, and the scene proceeds as it does in the movie. Although it throws in a little tidbit afterwards that mentions that River needed to go into the cryopod where we find her in Firefly, because the ship Simon was using only had one seat. Couldn't she just have sat in the pod without switching it on? A sweet detail that the novelisation introduces is that Simon chooses Serenity as the best ship to hide on because A, it looks disreputable, and he didn't think the Alliance would ever suppose that the members of the noble Tam family would ever be found there. And B, he found Kaylee too charming and pretty to resist. Hashtag, aw. The Serenity Novelisation briefly summarises the events of Firefly in a couple of pages. One interesting addition the novel makes is that it establishes that Jane was able to get the fake IDs and hospital uniforms in Ariel because Simon had reached out to Garcia, one of the people who'd helped him to free River. Garcia was also the person who acquired the baton that Simon uses to knock out Matthias at the academy. The novel very neatly answers the question of where the flying mule came from by describing how Mal eventually was able to sell the Lassiter that he stole in trash and used the money to buy the hovercraft. This is a nice explanation within the context of the novelisation, but I can't help but feel like much more could have been done with the Lassiter subplot. But if, as far as you know, this novel is the last word on Firefly, yeah, it's a cool way to kill two birds with one stone. The novelisation moves a number of scenes around to make more sense in the written format. One such example is the first classroom scene, which in the movie is part of the introduction, but in the novel it's included as a memory of Rivers while she's helping out during the bank job on Lilac, just before the Reavers arrive. The novel names Rivers' teacher as Professor Rao. Another interesting piece of narration this section offers is that Zoe is the crew member who scares River the most. That is, at least ever since Shepherd Book left the ship. This gun that Jane fires down into the vault, the novel states that Jane has named it Phoebe. In the movie, when we get into the vault, we see Mal talking to the guard about shooting him to make it seem like he put up a fight against the thieves. The novel expands this idea a bit and shows us that it was actually the guard's idea and requested that Mal shoot him before leaving. Mal finds the idea fair amusing. Instead of transitioning from Kaylee talking about Inara to the recording in Mal's hands, which is moved earlier, in the novelisation we instead transition to a deleted scene from the movie in which Inara talks to Shadra, the leader of the training house. This scene explains a little bit why the training house exists. With the Alliance pushing out further and further, the Companions Guild wanted to get ahead and begin training on the outer planets. What this scene does is give us a greater insight into the Mal and Inara relationship, which isn't really necessary for fans of the show, but for the general audience would have made things a bit clearer. Shadra teases Inara about Mal the pirate, and Inara's responses are very, "the lady doth protest too much." In the Maidenhead bar, the movie gives a very brief glimpse that the events from Lilac are being reported on. In the novelisation, this is expanded upon, with the reporter interviewing the guard that Mal had ordered to look after the townspeople. In the interview, the guard takes credit for the whole thing and is commended for his heroism. Mal would be peeved at this, but he's glad that there's no record of him ever being on Lilac. The scene of the operative on his ship is extended into the parts that were deleted from the theatrical release. It also offers the information that the operative had his memories from before his training wiped. Personally, I don't think I'm a fan of this. I think I prefer that the operative is a genuine zealot rather than he's had his brain messed with. As an interesting aside, originally the operative was supposed to wear spectacles, and instead of seeing this info about Mal on a computer screen, he'd have seen the feed in his spectacles like a Google Glass sort of thing. This might seem like a minor detail, but the operative spectacles are referred to a lot in the novel, to the point of it actually being distracting to read because the operative we know doesn't wear glasses at all. I would say in general that the operative is probably the character that suffers most in the novel. It's no fault of the author, it's just that the operative is such a great villain and is played so well on screen that his novel counterpart just doesn't quite live up to it. One of the most critical pieces of information from the novel is the backstory of Mr. Universe. In the movie, Mr. Universe kind of comes out of nowhere, apparently being an established contact of the crews, despite never being seen or heard of in Firefly. The novelisation says that he's an old acquaintance of Wash. Wash was second only to Mr. Universe in flight school, but this was just because Mr. Universe would hack into the simulation systems to score perfect grades. Wash didn't turn him in, and so Mr. Universe does favours for him from time to time. Now, I don't really like this backstory for Mr. Universe. I get that it's all that could be achieved in a few pages of the novelisation, sure, but I think there's so much more that could be done with this really important character. I really don't understand why no comic or novel ever decided to establish a proper origin story for this guy. Please, give us a really good story about how the crew encounters Mr. Universe in the first place. The movie never explains the circumstances regarding how Shepherd Book came to Haven. Of course, we see in Those Left Behind why Book chooses to leave the ship, but it's only in the novelisation that we get some actual info about the planet itself. We learn that Mal discovers Haven shortly after the war as a place where some of his old browncoat buddies disappeared to after abandoning the war effort, so it becomes a place he visits from time to time. A few months previously, Mal makes one such visit, and Shepherd Book decides that his place is here, and the townspeople are happy to have a shepherd join their community. In the novel, we spend a few pages in Haven before the scene between Book and Mal. This lets us see a bit more of the life on Haven. I don't know whether this scene was ever filmed, but they definitely prepared to shoot it, as you can see in this photo. In my view, this would be worth cutting back in, because I think it just makes the later massacre all the more impactful after you've spent a little bit of time with the people. Alright, so typically the novel adds in some scenes that were deleted from the theatrical release. This time the scenes of Nara and Mal running out of the training house, including the scene with the fake grenade. But the novel also adds a curiosity at the end of the training house sequence. The operative has Fanti and Mingo captured, and he tortures them to give up information on Mal's contacts. Presumably this was to explain how the operative knew about Book, Mr. Universe, the Sanchez brothers and Li Chen. Personally, I don't think this was necessary inclusion. It's reasonable for us to assume that the operative simply has the resources to figure all this stuff out, and to me it seemed unlikely that Mal would share so much information with Fanti and Mingo. As much as the novel has some good ideas, this one feels like a misstep to me. In the movie, we see the aftermath of the operative's attack on Haven as Mal and the crew do. In the novelisation, however, we see the attack firsthand through the eyes of a former browncoat called Bernabe, who now resides in the mining town. I think this was a clever choice because it allows the author to give us an insight into the event without needing to use Book as a point of view character and having to wrestle with the problem of whether Book's past should be explained in the narration. I think this was off limits to the author, and he found a good solution. Interestingly, in the novelisation, the operative himself attends the Haven massacre and hits Shepherd Book with his paralysing nerve attack. The operative, however, refuses to kill Book with his sword as he considers that to be a thing of honour, and he doesn't consider the shepherd who has just taken down the Alliance ship to be worthy. Okay, so this one is just funny. In the novel, and indeed in the original shooting script, Mal drops the F-bomb. So Mal is telling his crew that he intends to fly through Reaver space to reach Miranda, and he says this:
"So I hear a word out of any of you that ain't helping me out or taking your leave, I will shoot you down."
But in the novel and the original script, he says, "I hear a word out of any of you that ain't helping me out or taking your leave, I will fucking shoot you." And I find this really funny. I'm glad they changed it because it is a bit jarring and weird. I don't think that any characters use this kind of language anywhere in the show or movie because they always tend to use made up swear words or Chinese curses instead of actual profanities. But it is pretty funny to see this written down, supposedly coming out of Mal's mouth. After discovering the truth of Miranda, there's a real beautiful scene between Mal and Nara that was cut from the movie. I've slightly abridged it here. Wrapping his arm around her at her approach, he held her close for support. She put her hand over his. Right now she desperately needed his presence, his strength. In a quiet voice, sadness etched in every syllable, Mal spoke. "I've seen so much death. I've been on fields carpeted with bodies, friends and enemies. I've seen men and women blown to messes no further from me than you. But every single one of those people died on their feet, fighting, or hell running away, doing summit to get through. This is..." Tears now streaming down her cheeks, Inara said, "Mal, I need your help with this. I need you to help me because I can't." Mal pulled her into his arms, brought her face to his. They didn't kiss, but they touched, needing to feel each other's living, breathing selves. They needed to know that they were each alive. In my opinion, this would have been a great scene to have included. Inara consistently gets the short end of the stick when it comes to her scenes being deleted, and I always felt like her being Mal's love interest wasn't really given the attention it should have been in the movie. I think this scene, finally seeing a real moment of intimacy and sincerity between the two of them, would have been very welcome. So something that I think the novel does a bit better than the movie did is to emphasize that River regains her sanity when the crew find Dr. Karen's message on Miranda. In the movie, she tells Simon that she's alright, and her voice does suggest some deeper significance, but the movie's momentum doesn't really let us linger on this development. The novel's narration from Simon's perspective emphasizes more that he can, for the first time in years, see in her eyes the sister he remembers from before the academy. And additionally, during Mal's misbehaved speech, River is given some lines regarding navigation between Miranda and Mr. Universe's moon that further emphasize that she is no longer crazy. Right, let's talk about Inara's bow. So the novelization reflects the shooting script and screenplay, and what that means is that in the Black Room scene, Inara uses bow and arrows against the Reavers. This was changed late in post-production. Apparently test audiences didn't like the bow, so they digitally altered it to become this sci-fi bolt thrower thing. But, to be honest, they did a pretty poor job, as you can still see the bow in the wide shots if you're looking for it. They didn't replace it with the bolt thrower in these shots, but they just digitally removed the string from Inara's face and painted the bow itself black. This is how it's supposed to look. I think this movie is damn near perfect, but I would certainly support the bow and arrows to be restored if it were ever to receive a re-release. Hashtag Team Bow and Arrow. One of my favourite contributions that the novelisation makes is that it explains why Mal punching the operative in the throat was such a crippling blow to him. The operative is such a skilled fighter that it's been years since anyone had ever managed to land a decent blow on him. He's just so good that he's completely inexperienced at dealing with real pain. So when Mal finally manages to land that blow, it just cripples him. I love the symbolism in this fight, and so I find this edition just perfect. The operative is in so many ways this dark reflection of Mal, and this just adds to that idea. Mal's a decent fighter, but he's not on the operative's level. But the advantage he has is that he's so used to getting hurt that he can just take the blows and keep going, while one good shot against the operative can really slow this guy down. It's virtually the same relationship that exists between the tenacious browncoats and the apparently overwhelming might of the Alliance. I always assumed that this montage of Serenity being repaired took place on Mr. Universe's moon, but the novel says that it's actually back in Persephone. And I guess this does make more sense, as the funeral scene before it makes much more sense if it's on Haven, and if they've already left the moon, there's no real reason to return. It's also a nice moment of coming full circle, as Persephone is where the journey starts in the first episode of Firefly. The final scene includes a section that was cut from the movie in which the operative asks Mal how he continued with life after losing everything in Serenity Valley. On screen, Mal refuses to answer him, but the novel's narration says that he found something else to believe in. The final scene of the novel barely deviates from what we see in the movie, although it does sign off with a verse from The Rime of the Ancient Mariner. This is the poem that Mal and the operative are talking about when they describe River as being an albatross. And I had done an hellish thing, and it would work 'em woe. For all averred I had killed the bird that made the breeze to blow. A wretch, said they, the bird to slay that made the breeze to blow. I really enjoyed rereading the novelisation of Serenity, and I thoroughly recommend it to any fan of the movie. Now, I don't consider it to be canon, but it's still a good read nonetheless. The reason that I say that it's not canon is simply that in too many ways it conflicts with the movie, and I think the movie should be considered as the definitive draft of the story. I think that the author, Keith R.A. DiCandido, was writing the novel based on the screenplay and the shooting script for the movie, but hadn't actually seen the movie itself. In particular, you can quickly see that the dialogue often doesn't quite match that which is said in the film, but it usually does match the shooting script. Reading the novel, I often get the sense that DiCandido is searching for material to bulk out the book a bit, and as a result we get scenes from Firefly thrown in, and some original scenes that aren't even in the script. This is all okay though. I feel like these scenes make sense in their context, particularly in light of this being a novel written primarily for fans, rather than a movie which had to appeal for the general cinema-going audience. For instance, beginning the book with the flashback to Serenity Valley, rather than a series of expository flashbacks, is a very nice touch that works really well in the context of a novel, whereas the traditional opening scene from the movie probably wouldn't have worked quite so well in this format. One of the nice things about this book is that it feels like it's wrapping up all of Firefly and Serenity together into a single narrative, somewhat combating the dissonance that Firefly fans sometimes feel between the two. I know that it's pie in the sky thinking, but I would love to see this novelization revisited and just tweaked a little bit to align with the finished movie and the canon that's been added in comics and novels since this novelization was published. Could we ever get a second edition, alongside maybe a brown coat cut of the movie? After all, the 20th anniversary of the movie is on the horizon.